Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Marksman. So, I went into this movie completely blind. I didn't really make any consensuses before going into this movie of what this actually was. I just decided to just pick this out, and because recently I just kind of saw it on a list of movies that seems to have been newly released, and also like stuff for eventually someone to also rent on YouTube. So, kind of just decided to check this one out. So, really, a lot of people may not know what this movie is or was at all. Really, because within this movie, we end up having this movie kind of approaches things as a, like, I would call it a Gran Torino kind of Clint Eastwood like approach. It kind of seems like this movie was written for a Clint Eastwood kind of character, and they ended up getting Liam Neeson instead. So, not saying that Liam Neeson is bad in this role, I just feel like there wasn't a heavy demand for, like, yeah, this role is 100% perfect for Liam Neeson, but some people may debate or disagree with me because we could have it to where it's like, well, like, yeah, this guy has, like, or could be a person that, like, anyone at any moment could lose everything, and so really we have it to where Liam Neeson could easily fit that bill, and plus also we end up having this guy's character who is to also suffer a loss before we even get to go further on into this film. So we're going on into here, and reasonably, I would honestly say that I found this movie, in all brutal honesty, to just be a very boring film. Really, this movie really goes on to a thing about Border Patrol and how there are certain cartel members that are trying to get people over the border, and we end up having eventually Liam Neeson, who owns a patch of land that is near the border, and it seems that there seems to be some illegal people jumping over the border to make it to America, and so we eventually end up having Liam, who is to, or Jim, who is to stumble upon these two people, and we end up having this to eventually be a Logan like scenario, where really Liam is to take these people and get them to their destination, whether he wants to go along with this or just decide, like, no, like, I want nothing to do with you. Like, I'm gonna just push you on to the cops and just see you later, bye, and move on with my life. We end up having also that we have really Jim's character, who's besides this whole seemingly illegal alien thing going on, we have his life, who is going to eventually, slowly but surely, start to completely unravel and fall apart, to where we end up having Jim, who is starting to really very much rely upon uh, a woman of his, and we end up having this woman who is also coincidentally a police officer, and so yeah, we end up having Jim's character kind of relying on her. I believe her name is Sarah. I hope, because that's the only person with an actual name. So, uh, going on into this movie, I honestly just found this movie to be boring. A bulk of this movie is just really and truly just a chase film. We really have it to where eventually it seems that we are trying to figure out within this movie how far the cartel has in their hands any a number of things, to where we eventually find out that Jim is realizing that there isn't exactly everyone that he can trust. And so we end up just having this being a way to get somebody to a proper home kind of film. And so, yeah, so really that's all this movie honestly and truly breaks down to. And while I was breaking down watching this film, I was like, man, this film is like really a very this is a very long film. Like there's certain maybe quite possible action sequences, like everything was so stretched out for time, and also everything was just like, man, this is a really hard film to invest in and tie myself to, because I really and truly am just like, oh, once I figured out what the story was about, I was immediately just like, well, yeah, like I was really having that like backing out like thing of just going like, maybe I don't want to watch this movie. Maybe I made a mistake. Maybe like there was so many things unraveling in my brain to just be like, yeah, maybe I should not have watched this film, just because I realized that this is going to be one of those films that I wasn't going to be excited about watching. Really, we have it to where this entire movie, to me, honestly, really just ties between the conversations between Jim and Miguel. Really, that's basically this entire movie in a nutshell, because we really have it to where Jim rarely has any interaction with anybody, with the exclusion of his longtime friend that he has. But yeah, so with that said, I think that's all I want to talk about this movie in a cryptic like sense, because I also just want to, like as quickly as humanly possible, get this one in the books. Let's just say, because like to me, there doesn't seem in my mind to feel like there's a lot of things going on in this movie, and I've honestly also really just kind of pretty much said like via thing by thing almost what is basically to have gone down within this film. Um, Really, we have it to where there isn't like there is this kind of Logan like journey within this movie, and nobody has superpowers. I'm not saying that. Nobody's going to be reading off a comic book to anyone to find and or figure out some destination. I'm just saying that like this kind of has this like road trip like film that eventually has these small action sequences between them and these chase scenes going on, but everything else is just kind of like little commentaries here or there of Jim's character trying to figure out either Miguel or eventually figuring out how he's going to be able to make it uh, past this moment. And so, with that said, I think it's about time to call this a time to say it is about that time again. To just say that it is spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time. I'm going to spoil this movie. So, we end up at the very beginning of this film. We end up having a guy who seemingly has a sniper rifle of sorts. And so we end up having this guy who is to go on and see some animals going and killing one another off, to where he eventually reports it. We end up having Jim, who is to go and eventually also see that it seems that there are illegals coming across the border, and we end up having one guy who needs some medical assistance, so Jim calls it in for this guy to get a ambulance. We also had this beginning sequence of both Miguel and Rosa kind of going through their day-to-day like processes, coming home from school, and it seems that Rosa is getting a phone call from a man of hers that is to eventually be running from the cartel. He's running from the cartel because I guess he was supposed to pay them up, and he didn't, so they killed him off. And so we end up having eventually Rosa and Miguel having to run across the border because their lives are in jeopardy because of this guy dying and they may be next. So we end up having both Rosa and Miguel making it over the border to bump into Jim. And so we end up having these cartel members who are led by Mariko. Mariko? Mariko. And so I hope I can pronounce that correctly. So Mariko is to go and see both Rosa and Miguel and demand that Jim lets them go and collect them, to where we end up having Jim saying, well, no, like, if anything, like, like, this is my land, like, I'm doing what I'm ordered to do. And we end up having Jim mentioned that he is a Marine and that he's had some training and whatever. And we have it to where Mariko is like, well, yeah, I'm a soldier too. And my orders are to take these people uh, and take them to the right person. And so we have it to where Jim is not an active Marine or of any stretch. He's just a guy that is just wearing normal clothes, and he's just saying that he is a Marine because he was at some point. So we end up having Jim, who is to eventually drive off with these two people, and there is nothing that these guys could do. So we end up eventually going on to eventually have Rosa, who was actually shot and was actually killed. And so we end up having, like, during this whole moment of exchanges and whichever. And so we end up having it uh, to where reasonably Jim ends up taking Miguel to the Border Patrol, to a friend of his. And so we also learn that Jim is seemingly having uh, problems. We end up seemingly finding out that it seems that since his wife had died from cancer, that it seems that he is getting a little behind on his house bills, his place bills. And so we end up having a person who's like, dude, I'm going to be coming and collecting your home pretty soon. And we end up having, of course, Jim going like, well, dude, my whole life is falling apart, like, after my wife has died, and I have nothing to my name, and, like, nothing to for anyone to care or have a matter of. So we end up having it to where Jim is to go along and eventually just woe his woes to this police officer who's going to take him and get him out of this bar to just take him home. And so we end up having this girl like cleaning up after Jim, and Jim is like, "Don't clean up." Like, no, clean up. It's like, dude, I'm just gonna pass out on the couch here and I'll be fine. So we end up going along, and we end up having Jim, who is to eventually go on and take Miguel to the Border Patrol, and he is ending up leaving. We end up having Jim, who is to realize that it seems that the cartel are seemingly waiting for Miguel to get out of this patrol station, and so we end up having Jim, who ends up deciding to recollect Miguel, take him out of this patrol station, and ends up just deciding that since Rosa had mentioned that there were some friends of theirs in Chicago, well, Jim just decides that, well, I'm just going to have to just drive to Chicago now to deliver Miguel to this home. And so the entire time we end up having seemingly Miguel not talking to Jim. And so we end up having it to where really Jim is kind of even insulting Miguel to see if he's going to say anything. We end up having Jim who is taking Miguel to eat something and Miguel won't eat, to where Jim is like, dude, like, you're not going to eat a burger? It's like, I'm sure you're starving. And so the kid ends up picking up the burger and starting to eat, and Jim is like, yeah, I thought so. So we end up eventually having it to where eventually Miguel is to eventually talk to Jim and is like, oh wow, you actually do know English. Oh wow, that's great. You could have done this the entire time, but you just decided not to. Well, it's great that you're going to be a very conversationalist person. And so we end up having Jim who is asking Miguel, how is it that he's learned English? And we have it to where Miguel is saying, like, well, of course, school. Like, I learned it in school. And so he's like, oh, well, that's great. So because it seems that Rosa really wanted Miguel to learn English in school, and we end up having it to where Miguel is really looking after a girlfriend of his that he's after, and it seems that we end up having Miguel who wants to go back to where he was one day to be able to marry this girl off. So we end up having it to where Jim is to go off and uh, reasonably go on to driving Miguel closer and closer to Chicago, but we end up having the cartel, who of course are right on his coattails. We end up having some point where recently Jim is getting stopped by this police officer to eventually have him take him out of his vehicle to put Jim in the police officer's vehicle, to where the police officer was supposedly talking to Miguel, but he didn't say one word to Miguel, and he's just kind of checking over his vehicle and slowing really just Jim down. So we end up having it to where Jim is to really just go and eventually realize that this guy is quite possibly working with the cartel. And so Jim just starts beating the crap out of this police officer and eventually just getting his keys and getting all the stuff that he needs to be able to get the heck out of here and just drive off. So we end up having Jim and Miguel, who are to drive off with one another, to eventually go on to continue to just make it to Chicago. We end up having eventually where Jim and Miguel are to stay the night at some hotel, to where eventually it seems that the cartel are hot on their trail yet again. So we end up having eventually the cartel finding Miguel and Jim. And so we have Jim and Miguel who end up sneaking out the back window to eventually drive off to where this cartel is yelling at Jim, because we ended up having it to where Jim ending up had to pull a gun on these members of this cartel. And we end up having Rosa, who is to get shot at that moment, but we were also to know that Jim had shot one of the cartel members that was actually Mariko's brother, to where he's like, dude, you killed my brother, so I'm coming after you. So we eventually have it to where we go along here and we eventually have eventually this chase scene to go on, to where eventually uh, we end up having that Jim and Miguel are racing on their way to get to this location to deliver Miguel, and the cartel is hot on their trail yet again. And so we end up having right then and there Jim making a stand to just go, you know what? Like, well, like I am gonna go and shoot out these people before they shoot at me. Because it seems that Jim stopped somewhere to tell his police officer friend that like where he's going to be stopped at, and then maybe that he should be better off getting picked up by the police officers so they could quite possibly protect him better. But we end up, I guess, having that revealing where Jim's location is, and so Jim and Miguel scramble off, but eventually Jim stops what he's doing to eventually just make a stand here to eventually have Jim just start shooting out the driver of this car and eventually shoot out one of the tires to where the car ends up like donating. And so we eventually have it to where Jim ends up just kind of like popping off some of these cartel members. But eventually we end up finding out that also Jim had ended up also getting shot as well. But we end up having it to where Jim doesn't just die right here or there. We end up having Jim who ends up just taking Miguel with him because it seems like his car is going to explode soon. We end up having Jim who ends up finding yet another car, and we end up having Jim and Miguel driving to this location to drop off Miguel. And like it's kind of interesting how we end up having Jim who is consistently going to these gas stations for an Atlas because he's kind of old fashioned, and we end up having these people that work there that are just like, yeah, like everybody would just look up the address or Google Maps or whatever, like on their phones. And Jim is like, yeah, I'm sure you would. So, but we end up having it to where Jim ends up delivering this kid to this woman's home. And we end up having also Jim calling his guy that is putting a lien or a thing on his home and basically mention like, hey man, like I'll have all the payments and everything in a matter of days. And so we end up having Jim who is to go on to I think some kind of bus or a train or something. And so we end up having Jim who ends up going and opening his coat up to show that he is bleeding pretty significantly. And so we end up having, sadly, at the very end of this movie, that Jim ends up deciding to just die right here and there at the tail end of this movie. You just kind of see his eyes just kind of glaze over, and he ends up just kind of nodding off at the end of this movie to just tell us that he is to just die off, which is kind of sad. But then again, I'm like, well, of course, it's like the Clint Eastwood ending with Gran Torino, where we end up having Clint Eastwood who ends up like taking out a finger gun, and one of the gang members ends up shooting him, and then the whole entire like uh, uh, people within the town that Mr. Eastwood had helped kind of went and witnessed what was going on, so that way they could say, yeah, like these kids, they murdered this guy, this sweet old man, and to just really put these kids into jail forever, and so on and so forth. But yeah, that's basically how this movie just breaks down. It's a fairly simple film, where it's just for the most of the point just a road trip film that ends up having a illegal alien mixed with a ex-marine, and we end up having it to almost be like a Taken movie, to where like somebody is trying to take Liam Neeson's kid and he just won't have it. Because technically, I guess we could have it to where it seems that Jim had like without papers, technically just adopted this kid and is taking care of him until reasonably Jim could get this kid to Chicago. So with that said, yeah, like this is a real brief review because again, I don't feel like there's a lot of important things going on in this film, and really we have it to where not a whole lot of things get resolved after this. It's not like Jim just all of a sudden just bizarrely just turns his whole life around and goes back to marry that woman that had tried to take care of him in the early part of the scene, or I didn't even realize who she actually was really to him. Whether it was quite possibly going to be a lover or what she was to him, or maybe a daughter or something. I don't know what her age range was. But, anyways, yeah, like we really have it uh, to where we had this interesting moment between Miguel and uh, and Jim kind of talking about like Miguel asked Jim about love life, and we end up having Jim mention how like no like his wife had died of cancer, and we end up having Miguel having a ton of hope about him being able to uh, when he's good and old enough going back into where he had come from to marry off this girl because he wanted this girl for I don't know how long, I guess now. And so he's hoping that he can get through all of this just to get back to that girl, just to marry her off one day. So yeah, really those little talks are kind of interesting moments, but a lot of just like a real long draw of a film. Like really looking at it, I even remember there was like a Jean Claude Van Damme film where he was like a border patrol police officer. Like he used to be some like military person before that, and so really I'm like, man, like that this movie kind of feels almost somewhere ballparkingly similar to that, but reasonably like this guy was just some guy that was just had uh, this thing go on while by his land. So yeah, with that said, I think that's all that I have to say about this film because really it's a very simple film and it's just a either chase film or it's just a uh like a road trip film, and that's about all that it ends up just becoming. There isn't enough really here for us to get a lot of backstory of these characters. It's just, hey, get him to this location and see you later, bye. So I think that's all I had to say about this movie. Uh, I really didn't really and honestly and truly care about this film in all brutal honesty because it just was one of those where it was like, oh, this is that kind of movie where of course Liam Neeson is gonna have to do the right thing, and I don't know. I've kind of seen much more exciting Liam Neeson movies to where eventually we end up finding what the hook of the movie is, and then oh okay, like I can be interested in this movie. Um, like the movie The Gray was a very slow lead in, but eventually we got to go, oh, okay, so all these people are stuck in this like snowy environment. Okay, like we'll just wait to see what we can invest in, and then we did. To where in this movie it gets to the point of like, okay, like what are we going to invest in? And like, oh, here's the hook, and then you're like, oh, okay, yeah. Kind of reminds me of a ton of movies that I've seen already before, and it's not anything new. So with that said, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.